Should a high-earning physician even have an emergency fund? And if so, are there better places to stash that emergency fund than a high-yield savings account? Keep listening to find out. Welcome to the Money Meets Medicine podcast, where we talk all about the personal finance topics you wish you had learned in medical school. I'm your host, Dr. Jimmy Turner, and here's our co-host, who is a friendly financial planner from Pittsburgh, where my Demon Deacon basketball team just lost, Justin Harvey.
Dr. Turner, pleasure to be here as always. Thanks for having me.
I don't like you right now. I just want you to know that because you're from Pittsburgh.
I will say
it was so bad.
It's there's a lot of people from Pittsburgh who would associate themselves as proud Pittsburghers, especially when it comes to athletics, and I am one of those people. I haven't kept up with it's funny, I went to Villanova for undergrad, and Villanova and Pitt, University of Pittsburgh, were essentially Big East rivals back when they were in the same conference. I haven't really kept up with what's happened in the last dozen years or so. But I was always torn watching my alma mater and the team that I grew up watching playing each other. I still have a warm spot in my heart for our University of Pittsburgh Panthers.
Oh man, Wake Forest, and I know this is not a Wake Forest basketball show, but Wake Forest has been, let's just say, a disappointing team. It's like the of all the teams I've ever liked at Wake Forest, it's like the number one team that I hate to love because like I really like the players, they're hard workers, but man, do they choke bad in the second half. I mean, we had the lead at UNC, at Pitt, and NC State, and I think FSU as well, and we lost all four of those games, even though having leads. But anyway, enough about my plight with Wake Forest men's basketball because I am a huge fan. But this show, Justin, we're going to talk about emergency funds, and I think this is a really interesting conversation for a variety of reasons. But one reason being that people ask me all the time, like, should I have an emergency fund? If so, where do I, stash it? And then there's like the statistic sides of things, right? Where we know like 50% of the country can't come up with $500 in cash to pay it for, an emergency if it came up. And so it's both a real need, particularly for our residents, and then also, a little more of a question and where to put things if you're an attending. Do you run into this question much?
Yeah, regularly. And it's especially on the front end of an engagement when clients are just starting to work with us. One of the things that they're seeking is like a decrease in stress and anxiety around money. And a big input to that stress and anxiety is, do you feel prepared to meet that unmet need if you're transmission in your car blows up, or if your roof starts leaking? Like, can you write the check without stress, or are you going to be scrambling to try to scrape the capital together to make that okay? And that's certainly something we talk about a lot.
I love it. We're going to dive into that more. Before we do, make sure that you go to moneymeetsmedicine.com if you want to download a free copy of the Physician Philosopher's Guide to Personal Finance, or if you want to continue your journey in the personal finance space, obtaining own occupation disability insurance, or taking a course to help you figure your path forward. That's all at moneymeetsmedicine.com. So Justin, I think that the way that you just put it in terms of, do you have the cash, right? And if so, what happens? And I think that that's really important because, the way that I talk people through, like, paying off debt versus investing and kind of the order of operations there is, I talk about paying your credit card off really, really early, right? And the reason I tell them that, like, you should do that before you have an emergency fund, which is a question in and of itself. But the reason I tell them that is because, like, hey, guess what you're going to do if an emergency comes up and you don't have the cash? Like, you're going to put it back on a credit card that has 21% APR. And by the way, that is a financial emergency. And so you shouldn't have an emergency fund when you already have a financial emergency. And so, I know that 10 to 15% of the people listening, particularly in residency, and actually, I don't know if you saw this. Did you see this on the Medscape survey that, like, attending physicians, like 25% of them have like revolving credit card debt?
I didn't see that. Unfortunately, it doesn't surprise me. And I still talk to people who have misconceptions that carrying a balance from month to month enhances your credit score. And I will have like 30-something or 40-something-year-old physicians talk to me and say, yeah, well, I'm doing that, to keep my 800 plus, and that's not true, everyone. So pay off your credit cards.
You're right. So let's say that people have their credit cards paid off. They're trying to avoid going back onto a credit card in terms of credit card debt you're not paying off regularly. And just to be clear as well about credit cards, I'm not saying don't use them. I use credit cards. I've got a couple of them that I use for travel, but I pay them off each month. So that part's not a problem. But let's say that they've cleared the credit card debt, hooray, good for you, proud moment in your personal finance journey. but now, Justin, they want to start an emergency fund. So why should a doctor even have one? Like what are your thoughts on this?
The best answer I can give to why should a doctor have an emergency fund is it's like the moat. If I like to use the castle analogy, like the castle is like your family, your life, your well-being. The emergency fund is the moat around the edges, so that when the barbarian hordes are sneaking up in the middle of the night, they've got you have a defense there that gives you some extra leeway, some extra bandwidth. And psychologically, a lot of what I do is just getting you to be wealthy with the least amount of stress and anxiety.
Sure.
Psychologically is a huge buffer against anxiety. And it's not always a math question, because the math answer is, well, if you have credit cards, you should have like $100 in your checking account and literally invest every other penny that you have, because the math says that that's how you get the richest the fastest over full economic cycles. Right. Obviously, in the real world, that's not a good way to operate, because you're going to be stressed about the cash flow. So I find it helpful to start the conversation to say, what is it that we're trying to prepare for? What types of circumstances do we need to protect against? Because there's we need a, car repair, roof repair, the sort of the things that can pop up. And then there's the catastrophes that are, oh my gosh, like my house fell into a sinkhole and we didn't have sinkhole insurance, or there's a catastrophic earthquake and the insurer went bankrupt. And we want to make sure that we understand what are the things against which we can reasonably protect, and what are the things where we're going to say, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And the reasonable protection is usually things that will fall under an amount of a few months of living expenses. So if you spend, $30,000 a month to live, $90,000 is the 3-month threshold, where if you get hurt or if something happens to your income, you can go for 3 months and figure out a plan. 3 months is a long time to figure out a plan. For most agile professional types who are motivated, you can find a way to make your personal circumstances sustainable in that amount of time.
Yeah, no, first of all, if you're living on $30,000 a month, kudos to you. That's great. I'm not there. So I think that, I like the 3-month period that you're putting there. And classically, I mean, most people listening are going to know, like, hey, people recommend 3 to 6 months of your living expenses to save. The 3-month number for me is really important, for physicians in particular, and actually anybody who has own occupation disability insurance, because the elimination period, in other words, how long do you have to wait before you start getting paid for your disability on your long-term disability policy? We talk a lot about disability insurance on the show. A lot of people don't realize there might be a 60, 90, 180-day elimination period before they ever get money when they're disabled, right? It's like, how do you build, that bridge over the moat, if you will, not to mix metaphors there, to get to that period where you're actually getting your benefit. And I don't think a lot of people really consider that. They're like, oh no, I have disability insurance and therefore I'm fine. It's like, right, you are fine, but you're going to be fine after, 2, 3, 6 months. I think that's an important consideration. Granted, there are short-term disability, policies people have through their employer potentially. So there are other ways to bridge that gap. But if you don't have it, that's your minimum, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that the elimination period on your long-term disability is the perfect place to start in terms of understanding how much should I have. Like if it's a 90-day elimination, well, you should have at least 3 months, because you're going to have no income for 3 months if you get hurt. It's also an opportunity to consider. I'm not a big fan of short-term disability in general, especially in a time where yields on high-yield savings accounts and treasury bills are pretty darn good. So you can actually have an emergency fund and make money on that emergency fund. So there's not an opportunity cost the way there has been in the past. But for especially newer attendings, you're still building that up. A short-term disability policy is not a terrible idea before you get that emergency fund. You do want to be able to get to the point where that the disability income kicks in, but there's other variables to consider. And one of the most common ones is it a single or dual income household? So if you are the earner, you're the doctor and you're making, we'll make up a number, $500,000, and you've got a stay-at-home spouse who has 4 kids and you've got a mortgage and 2 car payments. If you go down and you're the sole economic earner, then you are going to have a need for a more significant amount of funds than a dual physician household who has a high savings rate. And literally, if you got hurt tomorrow, your other physician spouse can continue to float your family indefinitely. So those are two very different circumstances, and there is no, personal finance is personal. So these broad brush strokes are just giving categories to think about, but you got to figure out what's the right solution for you.
Yep. Guides, rules, principles. I agree with you. And that's probably the area where I get this question the most often is when there is a dual physician couple and they're like, I don't have an emergency fund. I don't even have disability insurance because, I've got this other person to lean on. And I'm always me being me, right? Like I'm an anesthesiologist. So we ask two questions in anesthesia. One is, how likely is something to happen? And the second is, if it does happen, how catastrophic will it be? So, when you walk in and you got chewing tobacco in your mouth and, people are like, I can't believe you canceled their surgery or, made them wait for 6 hours. And it's like, well, if they aspirate tobacco, that's not going to be good for them, right? And it's an elective surgery. This doesn't make sense. And so in the same way with emergency funds and disability insurance, I always ask people like, hey, what happens in that second question? So you're both in a car, you both get in a car accident, right? And then you have the kids that you just mentioned, like what happens in that situation? So I do think that there are really good reasons to consider having, an emergency fund. And I think for the vast majority of people, that said, I do want to make sure that before we talk about locations that for me, the way that I see this, Justin, I'd love to know your thoughts too, is there kind of a few different things you want with an emergency fund. You want it to be separate enough that there is some friction so you don't just like tap into it, right? It's not just like, oh, well, it's in the same checking account that I have all my other money in. And so it's like, well, there's not really any separation there. So there's not like any mental gymnastics to say, no, I'm going to intentionally choose to dip into this fund to take money. I think that it does need to be easily accessible enough that you can get it quickly should you need it, right? And then I think that ideally, this third one's a little optional. It's not mandatory in my mind, but I think it's good. Particularly in today's day where we can do this easily or more easily maybe than in times past. I think you need to try to keep up with inflation so that your emergency fund today is worth the same amount that your emergency fund, is worth 2 years from now if you never touch it. So if you can get that third goal, I think it's great, but I do think it needs to at least be separate from your checking account and easily accessible enough that you could get it quickly should something come up.
Yes, totally agree with all of that. And again, you're sort of speaking to the psychology, which I am totally into that, as you know.
Me too.
I have joked that my job is 1/3 marriage counseling, 1/3 psychology, and 1/3 economics and investments. And this is very much a bread and butter type of conversation. Another sort of factor that I would introduce before we get into like the hierarchy of how do you build this is, what are the ways in which we can build low or no cost emergency capacity in ways that we're not talking about like cash on hand. We're not talking about money that we can access in terms of like dollars in the bank. It's actually capacity from other means. And you alluded to this earlier with a credit card. Like if I've got 10 credit cards and they each have a $15,000 limit and they all have zero balance, that's 150 grand that if I hit an emergency, I could access. If you have a home and you have equity in the home, I encourage my clients to get a home equity line for a rainy day. There's usually a setup fee, maybe for an appraisal for $300 or $500. But then if you have $1 million house and you can access $250,000 of a revolving line at will, but it costs you zero to carry that line, then you could argue, I don't even need anything beyond what's in my checking account. Because if my transmission blew up or I needed to buy a car or my roof started leaking, I would just stroke a check from my home equity line. I don't pay any interest rate until I initiate that first payment, and then I can aggressively pay that back down to zero. So in those types of circumstances, credit capacity can create a low or no cost way of expanding that emergency fund beyond just money in the checking, high yield savings, and some of these other vehicles we're going to talk about. So thinking creatively can also be helpful.
Yeah, no, I like it. And actually it makes me think of an idea that I employ in my own life with my family's emergency fund, which is that there's almost like a step, right? Like step one is, we have $10,000 in a regular savings account that I can access immediately, right? Yeah. And then step two is like a little more friction. We have another set of money in a money market account at, my taxable brokerage account at Vanguard. And so, but that has a little more friction. And so like the way that you're describing it is like, hey, you might have these emergency funds that are a little more accessible, some that are a little less accessible. And then like, if it really hits the fan, maybe you tap into that HELOC and now you're paying interest back. But at the same time, like you do have it if something happens. So maybe that might not be your first step in your emergency, catastrophic situation planning, but it might be a step that you keep at your disposal.
Yeah, those are realistically, they're like items 6, 7, and 8 down the list on the hierarchy. But they are ones that do impact what do you have from 1 through 5, because if you have a robust number 6 that you can access reasonably easily, you don't need as much up top, especially if you have a high savings rate or you're in that dual income circumstance, or if you've got a taxable investment account that is invested for the long term, but you could hypothetically sell a mutual fund, sell some stocks, and move the cash. There's options there.
Yeah. So Justin, where do we start? Right, you're talking about this hierarchy of needs, if you will. So in the emergency fund land, where does this begin?
Well, having money, I call it like for operating expenses for running your household in a checking account where you pay your bills, you get paid into this account, you have your auto debit to your credit card set up, your mortgage is paid out of that account. Any like automated savings is coming out of this account. That's sort of where it starts. And for some people, that's all the further it goes. And I encourage people in this first bucket to put as much money as you need to not be stressed about bouncing a check. So for whatever your household monthly cash flow, I've had people tell me as little as $3,000 or $5,000 is enough for them. I've had others to say 30 or 50 is more the number. And you can figure out for your household what makes sense. And once you are there and you're comfortably paying your family's bills, then we get to this question of, am I a 1 month or 12 month of living expenses household? And what does the rest of the picture look like?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And actually, it's funny because one of my best friends that may or may not have been on the show has an emergency fund that is almost double what ours is. And just going to the point you made earlier, personal finance being personal, just tends to be a more conservative person when it comes to this topic. And that comes from a background of having a card bounce when they were a low income earner before they were married at a food market right there at the shopping for groceries. And it was really embarrassing to them to have to put stuff back because they couldn't afford it. Right. And so because of that history and that psychological impact that moment had in his life, he carries double the emergency fund, even though, we make comparable incomes. And so I think it's interesting when you talk about like the comfort level people have that they need, to be above in order to sleep at night.
And also in the context of a household, a marriage, spouses, you have to sort of build consensus. And that's a whole, we'll put a pin in that. We can come back to that maybe in a future show.
Yep.
So next is the bucket that holds the bulk of the rest of your emergency fund in terms of the cash. So you got your operating, operating is usually like 1 month or between half of a month and a month of cash is where that tends to land. And then you get into what are the other instruments you want to use? And high yield savings is sort of the obvious next relatively easy choice. There's a bunch of banks out there. You can just Google best high yield savings account. And I have a couple that I like. I don't really want to throw out any names. Jimmy, you can if you want to.
No, I'm good. Actually, I actually have a high yield account.
Okay. Yeah. Like 4.25%, 4.5%. This is taxable income for you. And it's easy. It's relatively risk-free because it's FDIC insured. And so as long as you're below those FDIC limits based on account titling, if the bank goes under, you're hypothetically, Uncle Sam's got your back.
Still protected.
And this is, it's very low barrier to entry. So that's usually, and frankly, this has for a long time been sort of the number 2 option and by a wide margin between number 2 and number 3. But right now, what we're seeing is there's these other entrants into the field in terms of where else should we put cash. And what we would call like an investment vehicle would be also accessible, earning a pretty good interest rate and very stable. And I'm talking about treasury bills or ETFs that would hold primarily treasury bills or municipal bonds of very high quality. And now we're talking about getting into a 5 to 5.5% yield, depending on where short-term T-bill rates are at any given time. This obviously takes a little more work. If you're working with an advisor, they can help you do that. Or if you're kind of savvy, you've got your own brokerage account and you want to place some fixed income buys to build yourself a little T-bill ladder. You buy a 3-month T-bill for $30,000 and you buy a 6-month T-bill. And then as those bills mature, you're earning this, call it 5.3%. And then when it matures, you just rebuy it 3 months out or 6 months out. That's how a ladder works. And you could do that, it's obviously a little more work, but you're getting a little bit more yield as a result.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and it's actually what we did. We used to just have our emergency fund in like a regular old savings account, because back when like you're getting like 1.5% in a high yield savings account, like that extra additional friction, and to be honest with you, work wasn't really worth it to me at the time. And then, the interest rates went up substantially. And so it started, kind of nagging in the back of my mind, like, okay, I should probably do something different. And so we ended up, putting things into a money market fund, and which, is basically U.S. governmental securities. And so it's a similar idea, taxed differently. But like, I keep that money there. It gives a yield, right? And then I just take the yield and put it into my more aggressive investments every time it spits one out. And so for me, I'm kind of mixing two worlds, but like my $50,000 technically is not going to be worth the same amount 2 years from now. But at the same time, I could take that, put it into that brokerage account, which is another backup emergency fund, technically, even though I plan to never have to tap into that thing. But yeah, we went the money market route, and so it's been fine for me. And honestly, that additional friction is probably better psychologically for me. I sometimes have a tendency to justify things that maybe I shouldn't be purchasing. And so, for me, having more friction than a high yield account was important.
Yeah. And once you start getting into these types of instruments, the nice thing about T-bills, and it depends on your broker, like what the bank where you're buying these, generally they trade transaction fee free, I think, based on what I have seen, or very low cost to transact. There are other instruments like CDs, for example, certificates of deposit, which in some cases are FDIC insured, or NCUA, which is like the credit union equivalent, where you can also reach those kinds of yields. But CDs often have a little bit more liquidity constraint. You got to wait till they mature. Maybe there's a penalty if you take them early. I still like this bucket philosophically to be very, very liquid, and T-bills are very liquid. ETFs, which hold T-bills or other sort of short-term, high-quality fixed income equivalents, are very liquid. Once you start to lose liquidity, I love liquidity. And so being able to turn it into cash at a moment's notice and have it in my checking account within a couple of days, that's a very important characteristic of this part of the emergency fund. So anything that fails that test, like if I'm going to be penalized for selling it, I just don't want to deal with that usually.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious on what your thoughts are on, you mentioned like, sometimes you have to pay penalties to take money out of some of these instruments. So, you got the no penalty CDs, which, researching before the show, it's been somewhere between 4.5% and 5.5%. And, the CPI has been around 3.5 to 4 over the last 12 months. It was higher than that, obviously, before that period. But no penalty CDs, is it a gimmick? Is this something that, is worth considering for an emergency fund? Does it make it more liquid in your mind since you're not paying that penalty? Like, where do you land on those?
Yeah, we can argue about what if CPI is a fair metric for understanding what inflation is. I think that in terms of the felt experience of the American consumer, it usually isn't, especially in the last couple of years. In terms of the specific, I think the felt experience is higher, and it depends on your income bracket and like how much money, what percentage of your budget goes to certain line items.
Sure.
But in terms of the question about CDs, I mean, is it a gimmick? I don't know. I would always want to understand specifically, like, what are we buying, and read the terms related to liquidity, lockup, any fees or surrender charges or anything like that. I have purchased some, CDs for my clients that have been a good deal. We have rolled them as part of a ladder. They were NCUA insured, and I feel good about that. Generally, I'm using T-bills right now. Yields tend to be a little better, and I know that there's no, I don't have to read any fine print. So,
So
go ahead.
I was going to ask you, so you mentioned the term ladders, right? I know people do T-bill ladders. They do, CD ladders. Then, in retirement, they'll do, Roth IRA ladders, So when you're using that term, just for the listeners that aren't familiar with it, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, a ladder is just a strategy that has a step every year in many cases, or a step over every period of time. So if I'm building a bond ladder, I have some bonds that are going to mature in 1 year, some bonds that are going to mature in 2 years, some bonds that are going to mature in 3 years. And you can use this to predictably have money maturing at a certain amount that is known, that you can use for a certain purpose. And one of the nice things about building a ladder is that this is a little bit in the weeds, but there's a strategy called bond ladder immunization, where you can remove interest rate risk from interest rate fluctuations from your circumstances by saying, well, if I know this bond is going to mature in the year 2026, and I know right now it's paying a yield of 4.6%, as long as I hold that bond to maturity, and as long as the issuer of the bond doesn't go bankrupt, then I can know that the yield to maturity is going to be my actual experienced return. And obviously the credit quality is important, so we should be using treasuries or very high quality corporates if we're building a ladder where you need that money to show up. But it's a way to sort of build yourself an annuity into the future, or in the case of like the T-bill ladders, because of the way the yield curve is shaped right now, which is, if you're drawing it on an XY axis, it's like up and to the left to down and to the right, negatively.
Yeah.
So it's what we call an inverted yield curve. We can sort of build a short period ladder by rolling 3-month and 6-month T-bills. And in so doing, we're continuing to capture the highest part of the yield curve and getting more interest than we would if we, say, bought a 30-year treasury bond that maybe is paying 4.1% compared to the 5.3 it can get on a 6-month T-bill.
Yeah, and I really like the idea too, particularly in retirement, because there's a weird transition, right, where you go from getting a reliable paycheck to like having to draw down money. And so making it where you have reliable periods where you get a bolus of cash feels a little bit more like a paycheck than just having to draw down money. And so I'm a huge fan of that. And you mentioned bond ladders. Another place that I hear people sometimes stash their emergency fund is in I bonds, which, I find interesting personally. I don't, and maybe it's just because like when I hear the word bond in my mind, it is an investment. And I'm probably thinking about this the wrong way, but I know that I bonds are created in such a way that they have the inflation piece that they're supposed to keep up with inflation. And then there's like this investment piece where it could be not zero. Like it could actually give you more money than inflation, is costing you. Because the idea with an I bond, right, is that your money today buys the same amount of things it would buy, in years future. Well, like that investment piece, like the inflation piece keeps up, but then the investment piece, like at least in the recent history, has been zero. So like it just keeps up with inflation. That's all that it does. There are potentially, drawbacks in terms of liquidity. It's got to be held for a year. You lose 3 months interest if you take it out early. And so I personally am not a huge like I bond fan. I know they got lots of fanfare. Like what was that, 6 or 12 months ago? And people were like, oh, you got to go buy I bonds, go buy I bonds. I didn't partake. But I don't know. You may be an I bond lover. I'm not sure where you fall on the spectrum.
Yeah. So I bonds are, you buy a $10,000 bond and you get your $10,000 plus you get the kicker, we'll call it the coupon payment that is equal to whatever CPI is for the last 6 months as of they reset in November and May of each year. So there were times when it was, and it's a U.S. Treasury bond. So there's no, we'll call it no credit risk. I'll put it in air quotes, but as long as the U.S. government can still continue to tax the U.S. taxpayer, then this is a no credit risk instrument. And there was a time when they were, I think it was like 9.7 or something, 9.1. There were some rates that were, it's like, if I could buy a treasury bond and have it pay 9%, that's kind of a no-brainer. That's borderline the expected return of the stock market over the long term, over a full economic cycle. So there's a pretty good risk return trade there, arguably. And so that was something that for my clients who had some cash sitting around, we're like, yeah, let's, make 9% on an I bond for a little while. Yeah. Now, since then,
to be clear, it's certainly not a bad idea, right? It was, I think, certainly something worth considering and reasonable to do.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, I think got some traction in the like physician finance corner of the world where it's like, hey, here's a free lunch. And I do, it's frankly, between you and me, Jimmy, and me, you, and all of our listeners, I do think it's like the closest thing I've seen to a free lunch in quite some time, because it's full faith and credit of the U.S. government. We can lock in a return that's kind of like at stock market levels historically, and we can lock it in for 6 months. Now, we can't make 9% for 20 years, but we can make it for 6 months. And if we can do that, then why not? But since then, as you pointed out, CPI has floated back down. And now I think we're seeing, I forget what the latest reset was. I think it was in the 3 or 4 range in terms of the next 6 month cycle. And so we're at a time now where actually, if we're counting basis points, the short-term T-bills get the edge in terms of the expected return. So depending, I mean, we're really making mountains out of molehills here if we're looking at basis points between these U.S. government-backed instruments. But historically, there was some opportunity there. Now it's like, yeah, it can be part of the package, but I personally am not super excited about the opportunities that iBonds offer my clients on a prospective basis.
Yeah, and I think there's two different conversations there, right? One is the investment piece, right? So when it was at 9 and change, very reasonable thing to do. And the other is like, is this an instrument you use for an emergency fund where there are some definitely more liquidity issues here than with some of the other instruments that we've already mentioned. And so for me, it's not really an appropriate place, or maybe not the right word, the best place I can think of to place your emergency fund, given the other instruments that are often available to people. As an investment piece, it just depends on what the interest is yielding at the time. But I do get asked about this, which is why I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And there is that 12-month front-end lockup, which can be a surprise to people. Like, you can't get your money back in the first 12 months. And then after that, you got to give back some of the interest for the previous quarter. So certainly you want to understand those constraints. And also, my legal department requires me to note that this is not any recommendation to buy or sell any specific security. So please talk to your own financial advisor about your circumstances to make sure that you're putting your emergency fund in a place where you can get it timely.
Yeah, no, that's good. And we got a disclaimer at the end too. So we're going to double up today. This is good.
Yeah,
so Justin, we talked about, it has been my experience that every financial planner I've ever met does. So, it's never a bad thing to have too many disclaimers. I think that's a good thing. Well, so Justin, we talked about, locations, we talked about purpose, we talked about some, attributes or characteristics we want in our emergency fund. Anything we're leaving out before we get out of this thing?
I think that's a good place to break.
All right. Well, you heard it from him. So everybody, appreciate you listening. As always, please share Money Meets Medicine with your friends, family, other medical professionals that you know. And don't forget to check out moneymeetsmedicine.com to snag a free copy of the book or to get your own occupation disability insurance or continue your personal finance journey. Justin, you and I will see everybody next week.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jimmy.